It is a damp, frigid morning in April 1945 inside an overcrowded German prisoner processing pen just outside Frankfurt. Mud churns under thousands of wet boots while military clerks at makeshift wooden tables systematically strip line after line of defeated men of their personal possessions. 56-year-old Hans Weber stands at the head of the intake table, wearing a frayed home guard coat that hangs loosely over his thin frame. He clutches a worn gold wedding band inscribed 1914, tightly pressed between two trembling fingers as an American military policeman reaches out to collect it. Hans speaks up in soft, broken English, begging the clerk not to take the ring, explaining that it is the only thing he has left from home. The room goes quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Corporal Steve Jenkins stops his pencil mid-stroke, and the surrounding guards freeze, their eyes recalculating risk in an instant. Walking down the center aisle on a sudden inspection tour is General George S. Patton, polished and formidable. Patton stops cold, his boots planted on the damp floor, his gaze falling directly onto the elderly prisoner, and the thin strip of gold, the air in the shed, turns heavy. What happened in the next 30 seconds would reveal something profound about the commander standing before them. And the answer was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we explore the quiet moments, hidden decisions, and forgotten acts that shaped the conflict. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it meant for Hans Weber to speak up in that intake line, you have to understand what a prisoner processing pen in April 1945 actually looked like. By the spring of 1945, the collapse of Western Germany was complete, and the Allied front lines had transformed into a vast intake network for millions of surrendering soldiers. Just outside Frankfurt, the holding facility was less a facility and more a mud-choked field surrounded by hastily strung wire. Tens of thousands of defeated men stood in wet, endless queues that stretched into the damp morning fog. The air smelled of wood smoke, exhaust, wet wool, and sheer physical exhaustion. Wooden trestle tables sat under open canvas flies where military police clerks worked at breakneck speed. Every single man moving through the line had to be searched, catalogued, stripped of contraband, and routed into the interior pens. It was an assembly line of defeat, loud with the bark of shouted commands, the scrape of boots on gravel, and the dull thud of personal effects tossed into wooden sorting crates. In a place operating on sheer momentum, the unwritten rules were rigid and absolute. An enemy prisoner did not negotiate. He did not explain. He stood where he was told, held out his belongings, and stepped forward when ordered. Confiscation protocols were strict, designed to strip away military gear, valuables, and anything that could be traded or used for escape. Personal items were routinely swept into canvas sacks without distinction. To hesitate at the sorting table was to disrupt the rhythm of the line. To plead directly with an American clerk, especially in front of junior guards and inspecting officers, was a dangerous breach. It invited immediate discipline, a harsh shove, or a forced step to the rear. Every prisoner in that line knew the math of compliance. Keep your head down, do not speak, and surrender whatever is asked, because any disruption brought swift, unpredictable consequences. The sheer scale of the surrender had created a logistical crisis that threatened to stall advancing armies. Third Army was pushing deeper into the Reich, but every day, thousands of newly captured personnel required rations, shelter, guards, and administrative accounting. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Processing 30,000 men in a single week meant each intake clerk had less than 2 minutes per person to complete search, inventory, and disposition. A delay of 30 seconds at one table multiplied across 100 processing stations meant hours lost, security compromised, and precious transport held up. In the grand calculus of war, an individual's sentimental attachment to a piece of metal did not exist on the ledger. Efficiency was the only metric that mattered. And that was the intake line where Hans Weber chose to speak. Picture the scene. It is 7 in the morning under a cold canvas fly snapping in the Rhine Valley draft. 24 military policemen stand in waterlogged jackets along makeshift timber tables, their fingers stiff from the damp mist. Behind the wire, thousands of captured men shuffle in place, a low sea of fade coats drenched in rain. The only sounds are the rhythmic clatter of personal effects tossed into wooden crates, the heavy slap of boots on churned mud, and the distant rumble of transport trucks moving along the Frankfurt road. At table 4, 22-year-old Corporal Steve Jenkins sits with his pencil, suspended half an inch above a damp ledger, his eyes fixed on the elderly schoolteacher standing before him. Around Jenkins, the surrounding guards and clerks froze, their attention shifting in an instant. They were calculating the sudden, volatile weight of the exchange. Every man in that shed knew the strict operating procedures governing captured property. They had seen guards disciplined for taking souvenirs, and they had seen prisoners punished for delaying intake. Nobody wanted to be the clerk who let a breach of protocol pass, but nobody wanted to push a broken old man holding a 30-year-old band of gold either, least of all with General Patton standing 10 paces away, his brass buttons catching the dim morning light, his posture rigid as iron. Stay with me, because what happened next in that temporary processing shed is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from the veterans of the 508th Military Police Battalion are remarkably consistent in shape. They describe a single moment where time seemed to freeze entirely, compressed into the narrow gap between a 3-star Army commander, a 22-year-old corporal, and a defeated schoolteacher holding a ring. Patton closed the small distance between himself and table 4 with deliberate, heavy steps. He stopped less than 2 feet from where Hans Weber stood trembling, his eyes dropping down to the old man's weathered knuckles. He took in the dull sheen of the gold band, the barely legible inscription, and the frayed, threadbare sleeve of the Home Guard coat. Not the way a general looks at an enemy prisoner, not the way an inspecting officer looks at a minor breach of military discipline. He looked at the ring the way a veteran commander looks at a piece of equipment that has survived a long and grueling campaign. Without turning his head, Patton looked squarely at Corporal Jenkins. Log it as a non-confiscable religious token. He did not wait for a response. Patton turned on his polished heel and continued down the center aisle, his boots crunching back into the damp gravel as if the line had never stopped moving. Corporal Jenkins did not hesitate for a second. His pencil moved rapidly across the wet inventory ledger, scribbling the exact reclassification before the general had even cleared the edge of the canvas fly. Around them, the frozen room instantly broke back into motion. The background roar of shouted commands, scraping boots, and metal gear, tossed into wooden sorting boxes, flooded the shed once again. Hans Weber stood at the table, his trembling hand lowering slowly as his fingers tightened around the metal. Corporal Jenkins later described Patton's intervention with a single word: surgical. There was no dramatic speech, no lecture on mercy, and no second glance. See, what most folks don't realize is that George S. Patton was not acting out of soft sentimentality or sudden emotion. Patton understood military administration with a razor-sharp, brutal clarity. He knew that rigid regulations were engineered to process total mass, but operational leaders were required to navigate human reality. If an intake clerk had to debate every personal plea, the entire logistics chain would stall and collapse. Yet if an army enforced its authority so blindly that it stripped away every last shred of human dignity from a defeated population, it created a far more volatile hazard. An enemy stripped of every trace of identity becomes a desperate, unmanageable mass. By reinterpreting the gold ring through the rigid language of the intake ledger itself, Patton did not break the rule. He redefined it. He handed the military bureaucracy a precise administrative mechanism to show restraint without inviting chaos or setting a dangerous precedent of lawlessness. It was a subtle bureaucratic pivot that saved 30 seconds at a single wooden table, but its ripple effect calculated across the wider pen was immeasurable. It allowed a massive administrative machine to do its duty without completely crushing the spirit of the men passing through it. In the grand arithmetic of occupation, that quiet distinction meant everything. Hans Weber was born in 1889 on Goethestrasse in the heart of Frankfurt. His father was a master bookbinder who spent 12 hours a day restoring centuries-old manuscripts, teaching young Hans that some objects carry stories too valuable for time to destroy. By 1914, Hans had earned his degree and taken a job as a high school history teacher, guiding adolescent boys through the rise and fall of ancient empires. That was the same year he married Martha, a quiet woman who taught music at the primary school down the block. Before he was sent off to the Western Front in the First World War, Martha gave him a plain band of yellow metal, to wear under his combat glove. For 31 years, through economic collapse, political turmoil, and a second ruinous global war, Hans never took it off. When the Home Guard dragged 56-year-old civilians out of their classrooms in early 1945 to dig trenches along the main river, Hans tucked Martha's last letters into his lining and kept that ring firmly on his left hand. He held no illusions about military glory or national salvation. He was not a hero, and he was not a martyr. He was the kind of man who understood that history is made of small, fragile artifacts that survive when everything else burns. When the administrative machinery moved on and the clerk handed the item slipped back across the wooden table, Hans Weber did not cry or express dramatic relief. He simply looked down at the entry written in dark blue ink, read the words classifying the item as non-confiscable, and slid the band back onto his bone-thin finger. He tucked his hands deep into the pockets of his frayed coat, gave Corporal Jenkins a short, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude, and stepped forward into the muddy waiting yard. To Hans, the general's intervention was not a grand act of military chivalry. It was simply a rare, unexpected moment where common sense had prevailed over the mindless churn of war. As for Corporal Steve Jenkins, the 22-year-old military policeman from Altoona, Pennsylvania, that brief exchange at Table 4 would remain the defining memory of his long service with the 508th MP Battalion. After the unconditional surrender of Germany, Jenkins returned home to Pennsylvania, worked 35 years for the local postal service, and raised 3 children in a quiet brick house on the edge of town. He kept his wartime administrative journal stored safely in a tin box in his attic, where a single handwritten line from April 1945 recorded how a famous 3-star commander had halted an entire processing facility over a minor piece of metal. Decades later, sitting on his front porch in the quiet hills of Blair County, Jenkins would tell his grandchildren that amidst all the mud, chaos, and administrative noise of total defeat, he had witnessed how a tiny moment of unexpected mercy could preserve a man's dignity, and it all came down to a worn gold wedding band inscribed 1914. Was General Patton right to intervene and alter the intake rules for an enemy prisoner's wedding ring? Some would say it was a dangerous breach of established military protocol. An army processing hundreds of thousands of defeated soldiers cannot afford personal exceptions, because once an intake clerk begins interpreting rigid regulations based on individual sympathy, administrative discipline breaks down, processing delays multiply, and organizational order collapses across the entire command. Others would say exactly the opposite. They would argue that true leadership requires knowing the precise boundary between necessary regulation and senseless institutional cruelty. By reclassifying the band through official administrative channels, rather than simply overriding the ledger, Patton preserved both the integrity of military authority and the essential dignity of a defeated man. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.